How should Christian leaders engage diverse communities? How do pastors lead people to places that they do not want to go? What does it mean to move at the pace of grace? Welcome to World Methodist Evangelism's Real Faith, Real World podcast, where we connect the faith within us with the world around us. Our purpose at World Methodist Evangelism is to help people live more fully, share their faith, and impact the world. We do that by providing resources, events, and experiences that focus not only on inspiration and information, but on implementation and impact. I'm Rob Haynes of World Methodist Evangelism, and welcome to this episode. We want to thank Christ Church Global in Memphis, Tennessee for sponsoring today's episode. May I ask a favor? Would you please rate and subscribe? Your 5-star review and subscription will help us get the word out to others about this opportunity and resource. Also, we want to encourage you to visit our website where you can submit your ministry moment so that we can hear more about what God is doing in your work and ministry. You'll find more information at worldmethodist.org/podcast. Today's interview is with the Reverend Coloma Smith, pastor of the University African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Palo Alto, California. For over 50 years, World Methodist Evangelism has brought together diverse voices, and Coloma has been an important part of that work through our Order of the Flame ministry. Coloma and I talked in April 2020 about ways in which Christian leaders can reach diverse communities, even when the people in them seem to have little or no interest in Christianity. Churches that reach diverse neighborhoods, towns, and cities are then better reflections of their communities and the gospel's message for all. This is an important and timely lesson, and I'm thankful that Coloma can offer wisdom on this in today's episode. Before we begin the interview, I also want to introduce you to something Coloma mentions a few times, and that is embrace. Showing and sharing the love of Jesus. Embrace is a training material offered from WME. It is available as a printed resource for personal study, small groups, or a church-wide initiative. It is also available as a face-to-face 1.5-day training, or it is available as a digital offering. We'll be talking more about Embrace on future episodes, but you can learn more now at worldmethodist.org. And now would you welcome my friend and colleague, Coloma Smith.
Well, thank you, Rob. How have you been?
I've been well, thank you. Tell us about yourself. Help our listeners get to know you a little bit.
Well, my name is Reverend Coloma Smith. I pastor the University AME Zion Church. It's located in Palo Alto, California. It is a younger skewing church, which has a diverse population, a lot of different ethnicities and backgrounds. And we took over pastoring university about 7 years ago. When I got there, there were about 18, 70-year-olds. And through God's grace, 7 years later, we're a vibrant community, average age of 32, a lot of different backgrounds, socioeconomic, a lot of different demographics, like educational levels, a lot of different ethnicities, a lot of different races. So we've really become a beacon out in the Silicon Valley area for what a multicultural ministry that does social justice and does great work looks like.
That's a wonderful story that many people try to emulate in their own churches. So how did you even begin to move it from, as you said, a few people who were older and of one ethnicity to more this diverse, multi-ethnic community?
Well, I think I can't say there was one magic bullet. But I think it was a lot of personal evangelism on my part, a lot of coffees, a lot of talking to people, meeting people, using a lot of principles that are in Embrace, which is that soft touch and that gentle intro and that caring deeply about the person. And then, people believed in the leadership, and then God provided people that were catalysts each step of the way, and people started getting more and more involved, more and more engaged. And then it just shifted one day. I think, for most people, for most churches, particularly trying to go through that transformation, a few things. First of all, a lot of the early people are going to be your direct contacts, people that you have fostered, you've met in the community, you've gone with coffee to. The second thing is you're going to be working on things that seem in vain at the time you're working on them, but it makes sense. I started a Facebook page, and people were like, we don't need Facebook because everybody knows what we need to do. And for years, it sat at like 20, 25 people, and then one day it just blew up. We started doing an email list. They were like, everything's in the bulletin, but we did the email list because we were planning for the fruit that God was going to give us in the future. And we just wanted to do that. So, I think it's personal evangelism, but you're also in the building setting up stuff. A lot of people spend time, particularly early in the process, fighting sacred cows. And I think in order to be successful, don't fight people where they are innovate in areas they don't care about. So, us having a Facebook page doesn't bother older members. Us doing an email list doesn't bother older members. But it was a great way to build a community, tell our story, and go from there. The other thing is that you have to be cognizant of telling your own story. Many of us go to churches that have no reputation, a bad reputation, a horrible reputation, and that's both internally and externally. So making sure as leaders in our communities, we're always telling the positive story. We're always giving the best foot forward. We're always talking about the things that God is doing, the miracles he's working, the lives that are being changed. I think sometimes we can get so caught up fighting the negative and the stuff that seems to be holding us back that we miss the fingerprints of God on our ministries. And, highlighting those fingerprints are how life changed. I'll tell you a story, Rob. I went to New York to teach a leadership training for somebody. And, the person had just taken over the church and it was highly fragmented. And I was in the room and there's probably 20, 25 people, mostly over 60 or 70. And, they didn't have the best perception of the church, new leader. So then I said, how many people have prayed at this church at the altar? And I would say about 80-85% of the room raised their hands. And then I said, how many people have had those prayers answered? Wow. And 65% of people that had raised their hands before raised their hands again. And I'm like, why aren't we talking about those stories instead of everything that's going wrong?
Wow, those are some excellent points there. I want to take one step back as we talk about leadership to a foundational step in that. As a Christian leader, where do you see these things being taught and demonstrated in the life of Jesus? What do you see there as a motivation for your leadership?
Well, a couple of things from the life of Jesus that is absolutely critical. I would first take the step back that I believe Jesus allowed things to move at the pace of grace. He dealt with these 12 disciples. They were definitely imperfect. They didn't really get it together till long after he went back to heaven. But he was willing to walk with them in grace for those 3 years on earth without condemnation, without cussing them out, just taking them one step at a time, one step at a time, right. One step at a time. Even after he was betrayed by Peter, he still took him aside after he got out of the fishing boat and said, feed my sheep. He had the pace of grace. And sometimes what I've realized, particularly in Methodist circles, is that congregations have heard the story from a new pastor more times than they needed to. So they've heard it. So, we are no different than the last pastor that came through the door. And that was probably 2 years before you got there. So it takes time. So that's the first thing. The pace of grace is critical. And the second thing is you must be in community and you must walk with people. Jesus actually lived with his disciples, walked with his disciples, shared life with his disciples. The days of coming in, preaching from on high, and then walking out and saying, I've done a good job and I've organized some ministries are over. We need to be walking and talking with people because they need pastoral leadership with them on a regular basis.
Moving at the pace of grace. What a beautiful picture. that sometimes people don't always do what you want them to do or the things you've been saying so many times over and over again in the way that you expect them to or the way that they should.
I agree. One of the things is people, particularly if you're going to a situation with a difficult history, or even if you're going to a situation that was great, people have preconceived notions, they have expectations, they have ideas, they have thoughts. There's so many different things that are that they are holding tight that it's going to take years to unpack and unfold. And it's going to take you pastoring them for years to get there. One of the things, that is a tradition in most churches is Friends and Family Day. And, I didn't have a Friends and Family Day for my first 4 or 5 years, I think 6 years at the church, because I had realized that the people that were living with my church members had heard the members talking about the negative history of the church for the past 20 years. Even those that had fallen in love with the pastor and seen them taken away, they were not willing to give the situation a chance because they assumed I was only going to be there for a short period of time.
Yeah.
So, there are things that, particularly with members that have been longtime members and members that are really there, longtime members and members that have really been committed to a church, you're just going to have to take your time and work with them and be patient. That doesn't stop you from working on other things like going to coffee with new people. One of the things that I did very early on when I got to the Palo Alto area was I called the local newspaper, asked the editor, can I get a quick cup of coffee? Me and my wife went for coffee with her and said, tell us about the area, tell us about the history. And we just sat there and this lady poured it all out and gave us a lay of the land, which was helpful. We showed up to a lot of community events put on by the city and just shook hands and started meeting people and started going to coffee. And then they started coming to church because there was a soft, gentle touch of meeting people and they felt like I cared about them. And instead of trying to beat my head against the rock of the people in the building, I slowly started bringing more people in, not word from outside of my traditional community. The reality is the interesting thing about poison is that you can dilute it. If you put enough clean water in poison it won't be poisonous. So my goal was always to bring more people in, shepherd them personally, have honest conversations. And they started shifting the culture and changing the culture because there were more people in there with the positive perspectives that hadn't gone through the church hurt, that were excited about the ministry, that were excited about the church. And we were able to, over time, it took a year or two, get more people that were talking about all the great things that were happening versus those that were waiting for the next shoe to drop.
So you mentioned getting into the community and walking with people, and then I think that's just brilliant to go to places that we might not expect, the leader of the local news agency or some other community leadership events. Sometimes in church growth, we find out that the people who come to our church are just leaving a church down the road and coming to another one because they might like the preaching or the music or they didn't like that over there. But it sounds to me like in your case, you made it a concerted effort to go to places where people may not have been entering in conversations of faith initially, but doing life together and then inviting them along the way to a Christian discipleship opportunity. Is that a correct read?
Yeah. So, to be clear so that your listeners understand, I live in a community where only 6% of people go to church on Sunday. We are truly the minority in many different ways here. That's why Embrace is so beautiful, because it steps away from the dogmatic approach of Christian discipleship, and Embrace work beautifully out here with the open arm and the invitation. It works beautifully talking to a crowd that is cynical, that doesn't have any cynical, or doesn't understand Christianity, or was hurt by Christianity, or wants nothing to do with it. The Embrace was really critical for us to get through a lot of that. One of my big turning points was in my second year I got invited to OTF as a participant.
That's Order of the Flame, which is a young clergy leadership conference that World Evangelism offers. Go ahead.
Yes. And I remember sitting in there and talking to people like Zach Zamara and Jenny Steele and Dave Smith and some other folks and Ivan Abrams and just feeling a sense of hope. And then, Kim, that was the first year Kim really taught Embrace. This was about 2 or 3 years before she let out the book. But what it really did for me was it gave me some new alignment and new perspective, really encouraged me to start embracing people and let the results take care of themselves. And, that was, I think, the really powerful thing for me.
That's really helpful. Just to catch our listeners up a little bit about Embrace that you're referring to. Embrace, Showing and Sharing the Love of Jesus, is a printed resource and a teaching opportunity that World Methodist Evangelism offers. The printed book is available on our website, but it also includes a way to share one's faith with humility, clarity, prayer, integrity, worship, urgency, as a whole posture of life as opposed to necessarily a formula. And not too long ago, Kim, our executive director, came to University Church and offered an Embrace training to the congregation. Talk a little bit about that experience and how the congregation responded.
So a couple of things. We were, I think, the first church to actually do Embrace.
I think that's right. Yeah.
I'd been thinking of bringing Kim out because I felt like our congregation was really ready for it. I felt like we were in a position where the learning was going to be really received well. We had a mostly new crowd in the building, so it was time to really teach Christian evangelism, but not in a way that was dogmatic to a crowd that would be new and receptive to it.
Yeah.
The one thing particularly I want to encourage pastors is when you do a program like Embrace is to not just make it an event, but make it a season in the life of the church. So we did 7 weeks of prayer walking our community before Kim got there, lifting up each of the principles in Embrace. As we walked around our community with a short blurb, Kim came in and did a whole weekend with us. And then she preached the intro of a series, and then I preached for another 7 weeks on it. I'll tell you a couple of things that happened. Number one, I had a 75-year-old lady look at me, been in church her whole life, and said, I wonder why nobody ever taught me evangelism like this.
Wow.
Because this makes sense. I had young people that were cynical, thinking of the tracks and the Jehovah's Witness approach, come back and say, this can work on Stanford's campus.
Wow.
And the interesting thing about Embrace is that it prepared us for the current season we're in right now, because our congregation understands how to communicate the gospel in ways that are not dogmatic and online and in different places. Because Embrace, I believe, allows us to step beyond our physical space and still meet people. I don't need to beat them in the head with a track. I don't need to try to cajole them. It can be as simple as phone conversations and Zoom conversations and house parties with the app. And there's so many different ways that Embrace is transferable beyond physical dimensionality.
It's a beautiful story that it is a way that people, no matter what their age or even experience with the church, can learn to get in touch with their own faith more deeply and then share that faith with others.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned things like 7 weeks of prayer walking and engaging in the community. How can someone, maybe in a place like you, that the community around them has a low receptivity to Christian teachings or are not active at the current time, how can someone, whether they be a pastor or a lay Christian, how can they begin to get these things started in their own church when they don't even have any idea where to begin?
Well, I think the first thing, Rob, I think each person lives in their own context. So I don't want to give it a blanket rule of what's first. But what I would encourage is first get prayer as a critical part. I would encourage everybody bring a congregation to prayer about doing a program like this. Number two, ignore the naysayers. No matter what you do, there are going to be people that are not going to be fully receptive. Say you have a church of 10 people and only 3 people come along. That's all right. Work with the 3. Don't spend your energy trying to convince the 7. Because, embrace is truly about us letting God step in and work. And if we truly just work with the few that we have instead of trying to convince everybody, it will be a world of difference.
And that's a really important point. I know sometimes in my own pastoral ministry, there is this tendency, this temptation to make sure everyone appreciates and values and even applauds what you're doing. And I think that can sneak into anybody's ministry. But what I hear you saying is prayer first to have a clear vision and then move forward, even if not everyone is following you at the moment.
And this is the thing, one of the things I said very early on in our conversation is don't fight people. People get attached to like certain music and certain worship and this, that, and the third. If you start with 3 people on Embrace, nobody's going to fight you over that. You start creating the fight. And I think that's the trick, right? You got to spend your time in the positive. And you work with the people you have instead of getting caught up in the foolishness of convincing people you don't have.
That's fantastic. What an important point to remember, because even Moses had people who were saying, why don't we go back to Egypt? Were there no graves out here? Were there no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die? So we need not expect everyone to follow in line right away with the vision that we're casting.
No, and that's why it's a vision, right? Not everybody has it. Everybody can see reality, but only leaders can see vision.
What a powerful reminder. So then how does a leader continue to give people that vision when they've lost it?
So I have a couple of suggestions, particularly with the leaders and vision. When I first started pastoring 7 or 8 years ago, I would give the whole vision that I had. And what I realized, although it was very clear in my mind, the next 7 steps, people would get stuck at step 3 or 4, or it would be like, that's way too big. So, part of leadership is understanding your community's capacity to process and work through information. I think sometimes as leaders, we give them the whole picture when we just need to give them steps 1 and 2. And then, where you're going. And as you start getting some wins under your belt, you could go to step 3, 4, and 5 and tell them about step 3 or 4 or 5 after step 1, 1.5, or 2 have been successful. So if I'm in a new church, I'll be like, let's start with pray. I know I want to get to doing Embrace all the way, and I want to do Embrace weekend. I would start off with I'm just calling a few of you together to pray about how do we reach our community most effectively.
Right.
I want to do, here are some principles I want to pray on: humility, clarity, prayer, all of that stuff. And just talk about those principles. Maybe in my small groups or Bible study, talk about them. Then by the time we get there, I want to introduce you to Embrace and talk a little bit more about that. Then I want to bring Kim out. And then, we're going to do a sermon series. I knew at the end I wanted to do an 8-week sermon series. And I know if I said we're going to review it 7 times or 4 times, people would get frustrated. So just doing it one step at a time, knowing what the whole plan is, but meeting the community at a level with the capacity that they can receive it.
And I think that's transferable. So I think about times in my own life or in lives of other people that I've counseled when they want to know all of the answers that God has before them for the next several years. But that's not what the scripture promises. It's a light unto our feet and a lamp unto our path, just what's before us, not necessarily a mile or 2 down the road. So what I hear you saying is you're transferring that principle into leadership as well by giving them the next step.
Exactly.
So, what are some of the things that you think the church, and I see the church capital C in general, needs to engage in next in terms of sharing in the community in a place like you said that is 94% are not participating in church?
So I feel a few things. The first step is we must create a church where people are willing to ask questions. They won't feel stigmatized, abused, or maligned if they ask a question. That becomes so critical, and I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
We deal particularly with millennial and Gen Zs with a group of people that their very nature is to be inquisitive and to ask questions and to ask why. And I know sometimes in churches we become very, that's just the way it is. We become very dogmatic. So I think number one is creating a space where people can ask questions. Number two is understanding that we have the greatest opportunity for the spread of the church ever, which is, during COVID-19, a lot of us are live streaming and Facebook living and podcasting, but making sure that we're making these avenues interactive, making sure our content is relevant, it's fresh, making sure that we do not oversaturate the people that we're trying to speak to, making sure that we are speaking to the issues that really matter to them, not the issues that really matter to us. Giving people opportunity, we're setting up something. We'll start this week where in my church I say, ask the pastor any question, and I'll do a Facebook Live on Friday at a certain time to answer any question that the people have to the best of my ability in a biblical fashion. And what I'm trying to do there is give people room to ask faith questions during difficult times. That's not a Sunday. That's not a small group. And still hear from the pastor. Because they have questions. I'm a faith leader. I have questions.
Right.
But, we live in difficult times that a lot of our assumptions around government, around school, around jobs, around work, around church have been totally decimated. So if the church doesn't present a space for people to ask questions, I think we rob ourselves of an opportunity to start talking to a whole new crop of people, a whole new generation of people.
Well, those are excellent reminders from someone who is well positioned to know that. Coloma, you're a leader in your denomination. You're a leader in your community. You've been a valuable leader at World Methodist Evangelism in the way you offer your time and gifts and talents to the community of Order to the Flame for the young clergy as they're starting out in their own ministry or early on in that. And so it's encouraging to hear you talk about some ways that you have engaged the church in reaching out to different ethnicities, different cultures in your area, and in a way that engages the current generations coming up into the church who may not be connected in a way that you can be willing to take their questions and also recognize that we do have the greatest opportunity. We can lament that the Gen Z and the millennials are not engaged in church to the same degree. Or we could look at it as to say, look at all of these people that we can reach out to. And I really applaud you for that posture that you're taking with that. So thinking about all of that, I wonder, how has this leadership impacted your own discipleship? Because that has to come first.
It's just impacted my own discipleship in a few ways. The first is it's forced me to slow down, take a deep breath, and realize I don't have all the answers, and I shouldn't position myself or the church as the know-it-all, but position God as the know-it-all or the resource during this time. It's all, it's all right to have questions. It's all right to have doubts, because I have that in my own personal walk at this moment. But exploring those and talking about those things is super critical. It's also taken away my workaholic nature, in that one of the dangers now is we're at home every day, and it's really easy just to open a laptop and just keep working because you're trying to be as productive and valuable and as possible. But God, there is stuff that God can do without you, and just letting God move and not trying to complete everything on the punch list. So it's been a season of stepping back and seeing where God is, and less about me trying to do everything to please God. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
It makes beautiful sense, and it's a wonderful reminder that we don't have to be the one who does it all, that God invites us into the work that is already going on. And though God could do it without us, God chooses to do it with us, which I think is one of the most beautiful lessons. And I appreciate the reminder that you've given us in that. And I appreciate you sharing your heart today. And I appreciate the leadership that you continue to give to the Wesleyan and Methodist church communities around the world. If people want to know more about this or want to talk to you about this some more, how do they get in touch with you?
The easiest way to get in touch with me is you can go to my Facebook page, Kaloma Smith, Kaloma Smith, and it's a public page. And all you have to do is just send me a message there. If you're not a Facebooker, you can also hit me on Instagram and DM me there on the Kaloma A. Smith. And then finally, you could send me an email at pastor@universityamez.com.
And we'll put links to all of those in our show notes. Reverend Kaloma Smith, friend and colleague, thank you so much for your time today and what you've offered to us.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of the Real Faith, Real World podcast. What a beautiful picture of moving at the pace of grace as we lead others, even when we don't know all of the places that we're going, and not everyone who's going along is so eager to get there. So thankful for Kaloma sharing that today. I want to ask you again to please be sure to rate and subscribe. Let others know what you think about this and get the word out. We want to thank you for listening, and thank you to the people of Christ Church Global for sponsoring this podcast.